The morning sun cast long shadows across the tobacco fields of the Ashford plantation, but Amara did not see them. She kept her eyes down, as she had learned to do, though the weight of men's stares pressed against her skin like iron brands. At 19 years old, she had grown accustomed to the attention her face commanded, the high cheekbones that caught the light, the full lips that seemed sculpted by careful hands, the deep brown eyes that held depths no one cared to explore. Her beauty was both blessing and curse, a double-edged sword she had not asked to wield. Master Thomas Ashford had purchased her 3 years prior at the Charleston market, paying twice the usual price. She remembered his pale fingers lifting her chin, examining her as one might examine a prized mare. "This one," he had said to his factor, "will serve in the house." And so she had been brought to the great plantation on the river, where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks, like the tears of forgotten gods. But beauty, Amara had learned, made enemies as easily as it drew admirers. The house slaves whispered about her in the quarters. They said she thought herself above them, though she never spoke a word of pride. They said she used her looks to gain favor, though she shrank from every advance. Most venomous among them was Patience, the head house servant, a woman of 40 years, whose own beauty had long since faded into the hard lines of resentment. Patience had served the Ashford family since girlhood and considered the household her domain. Amara's arrival had disrupted that order. "You think you're something special," Patience had hissed on Amara's first day, cornering her in the kitchen house. "You think that pretty face will save you from the fields, from the lash, from everything that comes to our kind. But let me tell you, girl, beauty fades, and when it does, you'll have nothing. Nothing but the hatred of everyone you made jealous along the way." Amara had said nothing in response, but she remembered every word. She remembered them all. The mistress of the house, Margaret Ashford, harbored her own peculiar hatred. A thin woman with features sharp as a hawk's, Margaret had once been considered handsome in her English village, but years in the humid Carolina lowlands had weathered her, and her husband's wandering eye had embittered her further. She saw in Amara everything she could never be again: youth, vitality, and a beauty that transcended the artifice of powder and paint. Margaret found reasons to punish her: a dish not polished to perfection, a curtain not hung precisely straight, a glance held too long or not long enough. The switch fell across Amara's back with disturbing regularity, though Master Ashford had forbidden any punishment that would mark her face or arms, the parts that showed. Then there was Jacob, the plantation overseer. A massive man with hands like slabs of meat and breath that reeked of corn whiskey. Jacob had decided from the moment he saw Amara that she would be his. He followed her with his eyes when she moved through the grounds. He manufactured reasons to summon her to the barn, the stables, anywhere away from watching eyes. She had evaded him thus far through quick feet and quicker wits, but she knew her luck could not hold forever. These were her enemies: Patience, who wielded influence over the other slaves; Margaret, who held the power of the lash; and Jacob, who represented a threat more visceral and immediate than any beating. Amara lay awake in her narrow cot in the house servants' quarters and thought about them. She thought about revenge. But what weapon did a slave girl possess? What power did she hold? Only one: the very thing that had made them hate her. The plan began to form slowly, like morning mist coalescing into shape. Amara started to pay attention, real attention, to the dynamics of the plantation. She watched who spoke to whom, who held grudges, where the fault lines of loyalty lay. She listened to the gossip that flowed through the quarters like water, learning which secrets were merely scandalous and which held the power to destroy. She learned that Patience had a daughter, sold away 5 years prior to a plantation in Georgia. The head house servant had never forgiven Master Ashford for the sale, though she hid her hatred behind a mask of obsequious service. She learned that Margaret Ashford suspected her husband of infidelity, but lacked proof. She learned that Jacob owed gambling debts to men in Charleston, debts that grew larger with each passing month. And she began to move her pieces across the board. Her first move was subtle. She began to seek out Patience's company, enduring the woman's barbs with patient humility. She asked questions about the household's workings, about how things should be done, positioning herself as a willing student rather than a rival. Patience, her vanity pricked by this show of deference, began to soften. Not much. Resentment had too deep roots for that. But enough. "You're learning," Patience admitted one evening as they folded linens in the great house. "Maybe you're not as worthless as I thought." Amara kept her eyes down. "I only want to serve well," she said quietly. "Like you do. Everyone knows you run this household better than anyone could." It was the truth, and truth, Amara had learned, was the most effective lie. Over weeks, she drew Patience closer, letting the older woman believe she had domesticated this beautiful young rival, turned her into an ally, perhaps even a protégé. And once she had gained that measure of trust, Amara began to plant seeds. "The mistress seems troubled lately," she remarked one day, her tone innocent. Patience snorted. "When isn't she troubled? That woman finds fault with everything." "She watches the master closely," Amara continued. "I've noticed the way her eyes follow him when he thinks she's not looking." "A wife watching her husband? Nothing strange in that." "No," Amara agreed, "though I wonder if she has cause." She left it there, a dangling thread for Patience to pull if she chose. The head house servant's eyes had sharpened with interest. The next day, Amara made sure to be in the parlor when Master Ashford returned from his rounds. She was dusting the bookshelves, her back to the door, humming softly, a song from her childhood, from before the chains, from a time and place that felt like another life entirely. She had a lovely voice, untrained but pure, and she knew it carried. Thomas Ashford paused in the doorway. She could feel his eyes on her, heavy with speculation. She turned, feigned surprise, and immediately dropped into a curtsy. "Master Ashford, forgive me. I didn't hear you enter." "No matter." His voice was rough, uncertain. "That song, what is it?" "Just an old melody, master. From my mother." "I apologize if it disturbed you." "It didn't disturb me." He stepped closer, and she saw the brandy flush on his cheeks, the looseness around his mouth that spoke of afternoon drinking. "You have a beautiful voice. Beautiful. Everything." She lowered her eyes, let her lashes cast shadows on her cheeks. "You're kind to say so, master." His hand reached toward her face, and she allowed herself a subtle flinch. Not enough to be disobedience, just enough to suggest innocence, uncertainty. His fingers stopped an inch from her skin. "You need not fear me," he said softly. "No, master." But she made sure Patience was passing in the hallway at that moment, made sure the head house servant saw her master standing close to the young slave girl, saw his hand extended toward her face, saw the intimate space between them. The seed was planted. Over the following days, Amara orchestrated similar moments, always innocent, always deniable, but always witnessed by Patience or one of the other house servants. A word exchanged in the garden. A moment when Master Ashford held the door for her. His compliment about a meal she'd helped prepare. None of it was improper, but all of it could be made to seem so. She knew Patience would report to Margaret Ashford. The mistress trusted no one else with household matters, and the head house servant had her own reasons to stoke Margaret's suspicions about her husband's faithfulness. Amara simply had to provide the fuel. Within a fortnight, Margaret's cold anger had transformed into something sharper and more dangerous. She watched her husband with hawk eyes. She questioned the placement of every house servant, and she began to watch Amara with particular intensity. Perfect. The second phase required more delicacy. Jacob was a blunt instrument, but even blunt instruments could be aimed. Amara began to time her movements through the plantation grounds to coincide with Jacob's rounds. Not too often, that would seem deliberate, but often enough to make an impression. She would emerge from the kitchen house as he passed by. She would be returning from the spring when he rode past, and each time she would glance up, meet his eyes for just a moment, and offer the smallest of smiles before looking away. It was a dangerous game. Jacob was not a man of subtlety or patience, but Amara had learned to read men's hungers in the 3 years since her arrival, and she knew how to feed them just enough to keep them eager without allowing them satisfaction. She began to position herself as unattainable but not impossible. She would be where Jacob expected her, but never quite accessible. Always another servant nearby. Always another task demanding her immediate attention. Always a reason why not now, though her eyes suggested perhaps later. It drove him half mad with want. "You're playing with fire," warned Ruth, another house servant who had shown Amara some small kindness. "Jacob's not a man to tease." "I'm not teasing him," Amara replied. "I'm simply doing my work." But Ruth knew better, and her worried eyes followed Amara whenever Jacob was near. The overseer grew bolder. He found excuses to summon Amara to the overseer's cabin, to the stables, to empty corners of the plantation. Each time, she found reasons to delay, to bring another slave along, to make their meetings public enough that he couldn't act on his desires. His frustration mounted into rage. "You think you're too good for me?" he snarled one evening, cornering her by the woodshed. His massive hand caught her arm, fingers digging into her flesh hard enough to bruise. "You think that pretty face makes you special?" She looked up at him, and for the first time, she allowed him to see something real in her eyes. Not fear, though that would have gratified him. Not desire, though he wanted that too. Instead, she let him see calculation, intelligence, the mind working behind the beautiful face. It unsettled him. His grip loosened slightly. "I think," she said quietly, "that you're a man who wants what he cannot have, and I think you're a man who will destroy anything he can't possess." "Damn right I will." "Then perhaps," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "you should think about what you truly want to destroy." She pulled free and walked away, leaving him confused and angry in the darkening evening. But the seed was planted. The pieces were in position. Now she needed only to wait for the right moment to push them into motion. It came on a humid evening in late August. Master Ashford was hosting several neighboring planters for dinner, a matter of business and social standing. The house was in upheaval with preparations. Margaret was on edge, snapping at servants and adjusting every detail a dozen times. Patience marshaled the staff with military precision. And Jacob had been drinking since noon, his mood foul and volatile. Amara worked in the background, serving dishes, pouring wine, keeping her head down and her movements efficient. But she was acutely aware of every player on her board. She watched Margaret's suspicious glances toward her husband. She saw Patience's smug awareness of the mistress's jealousy. She noticed Jacob lurking near the kitchen house, watching the back door with predatory focus. After the dinner concluded and the guests departed, the household began to settle. Master Ashford retired to his study with a decanter of brandy. Margaret retreated to her rooms, her headache remedies in hand. The house servants began the work of cleaning up. This was the moment. Amara approached Patience in the kitchen. The master asked for more brandy to be brought to his study. She lied smoothly. "Shall I take it, or would you prefer someone else?" Patience's eyes narrowed. She had spent the evening watching her master and mistress, feeding Margaret's suspicions with subtle comments, building toward some confrontation. The idea of sending beautiful Amara alone to the master's study, late at night with the mistress already retired. It was too perfect an opportunity. "You take it," Patience decided. "But mind you bring the decanter directly back. No dawdling." Amara nodded and collected the brandy. She made her way through the darkened house toward the study. But she did not go directly there. Instead, she paused in the hallway, just out of sight, and waited. She had told Patience where she would. She knew the head house servant would mention it to Margaret, perhaps with some carefully poisoned concern, and she had left the kitchen door unlocked, as she had done for the past several nights, knowing Jacob watched that door, waiting for his chance. Now she simply had to trust that her enemies would do what she had come to understand they must do. Minutes passed. She heard footsteps, Margaret's light tread, coming down the stairs. The mistress was checking on her suspicions, unable to let them rest. Amara heard her pause outside the study door, heard the handle turn slowly. At almost the same moment, she heard heavier footsteps from the back of the house. Jacob, finally taking his chance when he thought no one was watching. Amara moved quickly and quietly. She slipped into a small side parlor and positioned herself where she could observe without being immediately seen. Margaret pushed open the study door to find her husband alone, dozing in his chair. The mistress's face twisted with confused frustration. She'd expected to find something, but there was nothing to find. Master Ashford startled awake. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same," she said coldly. "Expecting company?" "I'm having a brandy and trying to rest. What has gotten into you?" Their voices rose, old resentments bubbling to the surface. Years of suspicion and cold distance came pouring out in angry words. At the same time, Jacob had entered through the kitchen door. He was drunk and angry, his patience finally exhausted. He expected to find Amara alone in the kitchen, or perhaps moving through the darkened house where he could corner her. Instead, he found Patience. The head house servant had been arranging the cleaned dishes, and she looked up in shock at the overseer's sudden entrance. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "Where is she?" Jacob growled. "Who?" "You know damn well who. That girl, Amara." Patience's eyes widened with understanding, then narrowed with malicious satisfaction. "So that's your game, sneaking in here after the house slaves. Does Master Ashford know about your habits?" It was the wrong thing to say to a drunk, angry man who felt his authority challenged. Jacob's hand shot out and caught Patience by the throat, slamming her back against the wall. "You'll keep your mouth shut, you old witch." Patience clawed at his hands, gasping. In the parlor, Amara watched, her heart pounding, but her face still. Not yet. Not yet. The commotion drew Master Ashford from his study, Margaret following. They found Jacob choking Patience in the kitchen house, the overseer's face red with rage and liquor, the servant's eyes rolling back in her head. "What in God's name?" Master Ashford roared. "Release her! Release her at once!" Jacob dropped Patience, who collapsed to the floor, gasping and sobbing. The master advanced on his overseer with fury. "Are you mad? What is the meaning of this?" "She..." Jacob struggled for words, his drunken mind unable to construct a reasonable explanation. "She questioned me." "She questioned you?" Margaret's voice was like ice. "So you attempted to kill her?" "I want that girl," Jacob said finally, his frustration boiling over into something close to honesty. "That Amara. She's been leading me on, teasing me, making promises." "Promises?" Master Ashford's face darkened further. "What sort of promises?" Now Amara stepped forward from the shadows. She had heard enough. She entered the kitchen with downcast eyes and trembling hands, the picture of innocent fear. "Master," she said softly, "forgive me. I heard the commotion." Every eye turned to her. Jacob's face flooded with desire and anger. Patience, still gasping on the floor, looked at her with dawning horror and understanding. Margaret's expression combined suspicion, jealousy, and calculating interest. And Master Ashford looked confused, angry, and, just beneath the surface, guilty. "This is the girl?" Margaret asked coldly. "The one you've been watching so carefully?" "I haven't." "Don't lie to me, Thomas. I have eyes. Half the household has been watching you sniff around her like a dog in heat." "I have never touched that girl." "But you wanted to," Margaret said. "And it seems your overseer felt no such restraint." Jacob started forward. "She's been teasing me for weeks." "I have done nothing but my work," Amara said, her voice small but clear. "If my appearance has caused offense, I am sorry for it. I did not choose this face." It was perfectly pitched, an admission and a denial at once. She was sorry for being beautiful, but claimed no responsibility for men's reactions to that beauty. It was both humble and subtly accusatory. Margaret's sharp mind worked through the implications. Her husband had been watching this girl. The overseer had been attempting to assault house servants. Patience, whom she relied upon, had nearly been killed. The entire household structure was collapsing into chaos, and at the center of it all stood this one beautiful slave girl who claimed to have done nothing. "This cannot continue," Margaret said finally. "Jacob, you're dismissed. Pack your belongings and be off this plantation by morning." "You can't," Jacob began. "I can and I will." "Thomas, tell him." Master Ashford, recognizing his wife's tone, and perhaps grateful for a way out of his own guilty position, nodded curtly. "You heard the mistress. You're dismissed." Jacob's face went through a series of contortions: rage, disbelief, hatred. His eyes fixed on Amara with a fury that should have set her aflame. "This is your doing," he hissed. "You little witch! You planned this." "I planned nothing," Amara said, meeting his eyes steadily. "I am only a slave. What power do I have to plan anything?" The words were carefully chosen. They reminded everyone in the room of her powerlessness, even as the overseer's accusation suggested otherwise. The contradiction worked in her favor. Jacob spat on the floor and stormed out. They heard him cursing as he crossed the yard toward his cabin. Patience had regained her feet, one hand at her bruised throat. She looked at Amara with new understanding and fear. The girl had orchestrated this. Somehow, she had turned them all against each other. "Get back to your quarters," Margaret told Patience and Amara coldly. "We'll discuss this further in the morning." They left, walking silently through the darkness. Patience said nothing until they reached the quarters, and even then, her words were barely a whisper. "You did this," Amara turned to face her. In the darkness, her beauty was shadowed, and something else showed through, something harder and colder. "You told me beauty was nothing. You told me I would have nothing when it faded, but you were wrong. Beauty is power if you know how to use it." "You've destroyed us all." "No," Amara corrected. "You all destroyed yourselves. I merely arranged for you to do it where others could see." Patience's face crumpled. She suddenly looked old and tired and afraid. "What will happen now?" "Now," Amara considered. "Now you will remember that I am not your enemy. Jacob is gone. The mistress and master are at odds. And you nearly died tonight because a man decided your life was worth less than his anger. Remember who saved you." "You didn't save me." "Didn't I? If I had not been there, if the master and mistress had not come, would Jacob have stopped?" Patience had no answer for that. In the days that followed, the household slowly reorganized itself around new realities. Jacob was indeed gone, his cabin stripped and empty. Margaret had won her battle with her husband, and Thomas Ashford walked more carefully around his wife, his eyes no longer lingering on young slave girls. Patience recovered from her injuries, but her position in the household had shifted. She was no longer the undisputed authority, and she knew that Amara had somehow gained a strange, unspoken power. The other slaves whispered about that night. They whispered about how the beautiful girl had brought down the overseer, how she had turned the master and mistress against each other, how she had orchestrated it all without lifting a finger in violence. Amara said nothing. She simply continued her work, keeping her head down and her thoughts hidden. But she knew the truth of what she had done. She had taken the only weapon she possessed, the beauty that others saw as her greatest vulnerability, and turned it into a blade. She had not struck openly, but she had arranged for her enemies to strike each other. It was not freedom. She was still enslaved, still bound by chains of law and custom. But it was victory of a sort. It was revenge served cold and bitter, the kind that lasted. And it was only the beginning. The months that followed brought changes to the Ashford plantation. A new overseer arrived, a quiet man named Samuel, who ruled with firmness but not cruelty. Margaret Ashford had insisted on personally vetting the candidates, ensuring that the next overseer would not be another Jacob. She also began to pay closer attention to the household servants, asserting her authority in ways both obvious and subtle. Amara found herself in a strange new position. She was not exactly trusted. A slave could never be fully trusted in the eyes of owners. But she was noticed. The other slaves gave her wary respect. Even patients treated her differently, their relationship evolving from open hostility to cautious detente. But Amara had learned that revenge was not a single act. It was a pattern, a way of living in a world that sought to break her. And she had learned that her beauty, the thing she had been taught to see as a burden, could be wielded with precision. She thought often of her mother in those days. Memories came back to her, fragments of a life before chains. Her mother had been beautiful too, and she had been wise in ways Amara was only beginning to understand. They will want to own your beauty, her mother had told her once. They will try to take it, to possess it, to use it for themselves. But here is the secret, daughter. Beauty lives in the eyes of those who see it. You cannot control whether they look, but you can control what they see when they do. At the time, Amara had not understood. She had been young, perhaps 12, still free, still living in the village where she had been born. But now, years and an ocean away from that life, she finally grasped the lesson. Beauty was a mirror. It reflected the desires, the fears, the hungers of those who beheld it. And if you understood what they saw, you could show them what they wanted to see, or what you wanted them to see. Jacob had seen possession to be taken. Margaret had seen rivalry and threat. Thomas Ashford had seen temptation that shamed him, and Patience had seen her own lost youth and beauty, a reminder of what time had stolen. Amara had not created these perceptions. She had simply recognized them and arranged for them to collide. One evening, several months after Jacob's dismissal, Amara was working in the garden when she heard someone approach. She looked up to find Samuel, the new overseer. He was a man of perhaps 40, with thoughtful eyes and a bearing that suggested he had not always been in his current position. "Amara," he said quietly, "a moment of your time." She stood, wary but showing nothing. "Yes, sir." "I've been observing the plantation," he continued, his tone conversational, "trying to understand how things work here, the dynamics among the slaves, the household, the family." "Yes, sir." "You're an interesting person to observe." Her heart quickened, but her face remained calm. "I'm just a house servant, sir." "Yes," he agreed, "and the last overseer was just an overseer, until he wasn't." He paused, studying her. "I've spoken with some of the other slaves. They tell me you're clever. Some even say you're dangerous." "People say many things, sir. That doesn't make them true." Samuel smiled slightly. "No, it doesn't. But I've learned to trust patterns more than words. And the pattern here is clear. Jacob left in disgrace. The master and mistress have never been more careful around each other. Patience, who used to rule the household staff with an iron hand, now moves cautiously. And you? You continue to work quietly, keeping your head down, staying out of trouble. Is there something wrong with that, sir?" "Not at all. In fact, it's quite wise." He paused again, considering his next words carefully. "I want you to understand something, Amara. I'm not Jacob. I don't intend to make his mistakes. I see you for what you are, a woman with a remarkable gift for understanding people and circumstances. That's not a criticism. It's an observation." "I don't understand, sir." "I think you do." He glanced back toward the great house. The master and mistress have their battles. The household has its tensions. and you navigate all of it with impressive skill. So here is what I want you to know. I have no interest in harming you or in becoming your enemy. Neither do I intend to be manipulated. We can coexist peacefully if we respect each other's positions. It was the most honest conversation any white person had ever had with her. Amara took a calculated risk. I appreciate your directness, sir. May I be equally direct, please? I have no desire to harm anyone. I simply wish to survive in a world that gives me little choice about the circumstances of my survival. If you treat the slaves fairly, if you don't abuse your position, you will have no trouble from me. Samuel nodded slowly. A fair bargain. I'll hold you to it, and you may hold me to mine. They understood each other. It was not friendship. The power differential was too great for that. But it was a form of respect. Perhaps even a kind of peace. Years passed. Amara remained at the Ashford plantation, watching the world change around her in small increments. Master Ashford died of a heart ailment when Amara was 23. Margaret sold the plantation and moved back to Charleston, and the new owners were less invested in the household dynamics that had once seemed so important. Patience grew old and was eventually given her freedom in Master Ashford's will, a small mercy that surprised everyone. She moved to Charleston as well, where she worked as a laundress and lived in a tiny room near the docks. Amara was sold again at 25, then again at 27. Each time her beauty commanded high prices. Each time she found herself in new households, with new dynamics, new enemies, new challenges, and each time she learned. She honed her skills, her understanding of human nature, her ability to read the currents of desire and resentment and fear that swirled around her. She learned that revenge was not always possible, but survival always was. She learned that the same beauty that made her vulnerable also made her valuable, and value, however twisted and wrong, was a form of power. She learned to wield that power with increasing sophistication. Sometimes her revenge was small, ensuring that a cruel overseer was seen at his worst by those who employed him. Sometimes it was more significant, helping to bring about the downfall of those who abused their positions. She never acted out of simple spite. She acted strategically, carefully, always with an eye toward her own survival and the survival of those few people she came to care about. By the time she was 30, Amara had developed a reputation among certain circles. There were whispers about the beautiful slave woman who seemed to bring misfortune to those who mistreated her. Some called it witchcraft. Others said she was simply unlucky to own. But those who paid attention, those who understood the real mechanisms of power and influence, recognized something else: intelligence wielded with precision. She never gained her freedom. The laws of the time, the structures of society, the brutal economics of slavery, all of it conspired to keep her in chains. But within those constraints, she carved out a life that was more than mere survival. She carved out a form of agency, a way of striking back at a world that sought to reduce her to property. Her beauty remained, even as she aged. It changed, deepened, became something more nuanced than simple youth. And she continued to use it, not as Jacob had wanted to use her, not as Margaret had feared, but as a tool of her own making. In her quiet moments, alone in whatever quarters she was given, Amara thought about that girl who had stood in the Charleston market at 16, terrified and alone. She thought about the lessons she had learned the hard way. And she thought about her mother's words, spoken so many years ago in a world that no longer existed except in memory. Beauty lives in the eyes of those who see it. She had learned to control what they saw. In a world that gave her almost no control at all, that was everything. And if it was revenge against the Jacobs and Margarets and Patiences of the world, against the system that had enslaved her, against fate itself, then so be it. It was the revenge of the powerless, subtle and patient and enduring. It was the revenge of survival itself. Many years later, when Amara was past 50, and her beauty had finally begun to fade into the dignified grace of age, she found herself in a small cabin on a plantation in Virginia. The world was changing. There were whispers of abolition, of war, of freedom. She did not know if she would live to see any of it, but she had survived. Against all odds, against all the forces that had sought to break her, she had survived. And more than that, she had lived, not freely, never freely, but with her mind intact, her spirit unbroken, her sense of self preserved. She thought often of her mother in those final years. She wondered if her mother would be proud of what she had done, of the weapons she had forged from her chains. She hoped so, because in the end, that was what revenge had meant for Amara. Not the destruction of her enemies, though some had been destroyed, but the preservation of herself, the refusal to be broken, the determination to use every tool at her disposal, even tools she never asked for, to carve out something resembling life from the stone of bondage. It was a bitter victory, earned at terrible cost. But it was victory nonetheless, and it was hers.